morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Cadet Nardowich, joined here today with Cadet Stubbs, Cadet DeJoe, and Cadet Gula. The issue at hand today is instances of Afghani police and military members practicing Bacha Bazi on American forward operating bases. Currently, the U.S. has no effective policy to deal with this issue. The practice undermines the mission that we have in Afghanistan and is unethical. Just a quick definition of Bacha Bazi, literally means boy play. Bacha Bazi is an unlawful practice in Afghanistan in which boys dance while dressed as girls and are sexually abused by their masters. Our overall policy, U.S. and the Afghan forces will establish and enforce an environment that respects human rights and dignity for all persons on forward operating bases and throughout the area of operations. We have short-term and long-term goals in this. Short-term, prohibit Chai boys, which are what they call the victims of Bacha Bazi. Prohibit them from forward operating bases. This solves the immediate issue of this practice being done on forward operating bases. To go for the long-term goal, which is to eventually extinguish it from the practice from the country, we have encouraging reporting of all incidents as a duty for U.S. and Afghan forces. Again, long-term goal, establish a mechanism to investigate and prosecute offenders, and conduct culturally sensitive information campaigns to counter the practice. This, again, these 3 points would be for the long-term goal of extinguishing the practice from the country. This policy reinforces the legitimacy of Afghan security forces as servants of the people. We will be going over the ethical basis for this policy, the legal, how this policy is legal, grounded in law, and an implementation plan that will strategically benefit the United States and our mission in Afghanistan. To cover the ethical portion of our policy, I will hand it off to Cadet Gula.
Now, from our definition, Bacha Bazi literally means boy play. It is an act that is slavery, child molestation, sexual assault, and abuse. Based on that, it is categorized and is a form that is categorized as a human rights violation. So already it is unethical based on those premises. It also violates the golden rule, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. So based just on that, it would be considered unethical. Now, it also has an effect on the victims. These are young boys who are being targeted usually by wealthy masters, wealthy older men. And what they do is they usually will target a poor family, and they will coerce these boys into serving them, promising them visions of grandeur, money, maybe a step up in social standing. At lures, most of these boys go into this process not knowing what their true purpose, what is eventually going to happen to them to satisfy these men's sexual desires. And since they are recruited at such a young age, this process, when they are older adults, these children, these young boys, will actually do this process as adults. They will perform Bacha Bazi, and this toxic cycle will continue. This also has a negative effect on the victims. This is on the victims. This act in itself is rape. These children or young boys are being violated both physically and mentally by the abusers. Now, these are not just young boys. These are sons, these are nephews, these are children of the community. And how the community, as referenced in the article, has a negative view on this practice of Bacha Bazi. These are mothers watching their sons being abused. These are fathers seeing this. These are sisters, brothers, family members watching this practice happen and not being able to stop it. Because this practice is also being performed by some members of the Afghani security force, who is supposed to serve and protect the community. How is the community supposed to feel if they see these members performing this act, molesting their children, raping their sons? The community feels like they're at a loss. Now, This act is not all of Afghanistan, it's just a tribe called the Pashtuns. But yet it is a practice that is outlawed in Afghanistan, yet it is still happening. Now it also has, not just on the community, but it also affects the outside world and also on our home front. It has a negative effect on our troops. Our troops feel like they have to turn a blind eye towards this practice. It is happening on and off our bases, yet there is nothing they feel like they can do. And so in some instances, this practice of Bacha Bazi has led to death. In the case of Lance Corporal Buckley, United States Marine Corps, he was shot and killed by one of these child boys, one of these boys who had Bacha Bazi, being raped by the older men, by Afghan security forces. And we're supposed to, now to the community, how are we supposed to be perceived if we are allowing this act to happen? We're supposed to work hand in hand with the Afghan security forces, yet this delegitimizes our view, this delegitimizes our credibility if we are allowing this practice to continue. And so that's why we want a policy that will prevent these assaults from happening. Our policy is to protect the basic human rights that every individual has that is granted to them. And by the act of Bacha Bazi being performed, those rights are being violated. Now, some objections for a policy would be, are we influencing, are we putting Western culture on the Afghani culture? No, because in all versions, in most versions of the Holy Book, in their case, the Quran, the Holy Book states some versions of the Golden Rule, do unto others as you do unto yourselves. So the act of Bacha Bazi is violating that Golden Rule that most holy books preach. Also, another objection would be, what right do our troops have to regulate or enforce? Well, we are there working hand in hand with the Afghani security forces. We are there as partners, and we need to have some way for our troops to feel safe, to feel that they can stop this practice from happening. Now, I'll leave it off to cut to Joe. We'll go into the legal aspect of our policy.
So the legal justification for our policy goes hand in hand with the ethical basis. It codifies in law our stance. Now, we use international as well as Afghani law to justify our policy. Several UN charters and declarations, as well as native laws of Afghanistan. The United Nations Declaration of Basic Human Rights has several provisions which condemn policy similar to this. These United Nations charters speak explicitly to cases very similar to Bacha Bazi. The protocol amending the Slavery Convention, the Convention of the Suppression of the Traffic and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others, as well as the Convention on the Rights of the Child. All three of these United Nations charters were not only signed and ratified by the United States and other United Nations members, but Afghanistan as well. So here's a prime example of Afghanistan, the government, the country as a whole, condemning this practice and practices similar to this. The Afghani Constitution, as well as several other laws, condemn this practice specifically. And the Quran speaks against harming others. And with Afghanistan being a Muslim majority state, several areas practice Sharia law, which uses the Quran as well as another holy book as the legal basis in that area. And the Quran speaks out against actions such as this. Now, within the United Nations Declaration of Basic Human Rights, they list several rights given to each individual on this earth. Article 2 states, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, including gender, race, age, and things of this nature. Article 3 states, everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. So this states that the individual, as well as the community, has a responsibility to protect oneself and each other from being violated, from being oppressed, or from being abused. And Article 4 states, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all forms. Bacha Bazi is a form of slavery, not only in the traditional sense where these boys are serving in the household of their masters, but also sexual slavery, slavery nonetheless. And as mentioned, outlawed by this Declaration of Basic Human Rights. The other articles mentioned reinforce these three main ideals. Now to Cadet Stubbs for the strategic implementation.
Our mission in Afghanistan is to train, advise, and assist. Our end goal in Afghanistan is to create a recognized Afghan government that is stable and weed out corruption. To do this, with our policy, we will meet with the Afghan leaders, with our commanding general, which includes the president, and conduct a joint press conference denouncing the practice of Bacha Bazi and the disrespect for human dignity as a whole. This joint IG, or Inspector General, will consist of members of American and Afghani members who have military and civilian backgrounds to make it diverse and ease of access so military members in our allied forces and Afghan members can communicate and go up the chain of command. Therefore, for instance, there's an allegation of rape or practice of Bacha Bazi. They can report to the IG, which in turn will investigate all allegations and violations of human dignity. We will train the Afghan army and police so they will be able to react and deal with these situations so they will not be caught in the dark. We will also, through educational programs and Jirga meetings, we will conduct training with the civilians as well so they will understand what Bacha Bazi is and why it's illegal in that country. Adding to that, Jirga meetings are meetings where there are elder Afghan locals who are leaders per se that have heavy influence among their people and are the decision makers. Next slide, please. Now, imagine this as a three-legged stool. A three-legged stool needs to be stable. You can't have one longer than the other. Now, by, with, and through the Afghan government, we will enact our policy. By educating professional military and security forces, we will teach them why Bacha Bazi is wrong and why it's legally unjust. As stated before, we've had corruption among their own police forces and army members. To get rid of this, we need to educate them on why it's wrong and weed out those corrupt members. With communicating with the Afghan people, we will have a direct line of communication through the IG and through the local leaders of the Afghan police forces and the Jirga members to understand why Bacha Bazi is wrong and how we can correct that. And we will enforce this through the IG. Now, once again, it's a three-legged stool. So imagine the recognized Afghan government as the top of that stool, and these are the three legs. With one short than the other, it'll fall and not be stable. And our end goal in Afghanistan is to have a stable Afghan government. Now, what if this doesn't work? What if they refuse to cooperate with us, or what if they don't want to, or fail to meet these simple requirements? We have something called the Leahy Amendment. Now, Cadet Joe will explain the Leahy Amendment.
So the Leahy Amendment is a piece of U.S. legislation passed in the late 1960s, which allows the Department of Defense, as well as the Department of State, through separate channels, to remove funding to U.S. allies found in violation of basic human rights. Now, we can pull funding not from the entire nation. We could do that if need be. However, we can also remove funding at the unit level, the unit being interpreted as the smallest operational group in the field, with the discretion of the commanding general as well as other commanders within the nation, within Afghanistan. We can use this policy to remove funding and encourage self-policing within Afghanistan. So by doing this, even the public will see it not as the United States enforcing Western culture and Western ideals on Afghanistan, but rather Afghanistan itself policing their own and enforcing their own standards.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have established that Bacha Bazi has negative effects on the individual, the community, and our troops, and that we are ethically bound to deal with this situation. Our policy is well rooted not only in international law, but in Afghani law and culture as well. We have an implementation plan that is
5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. We have an implementation plan that is strategically beneficial for our overall mission in Afghanistan. That's why we maintain that our plan is ethical, legal, and strategically beneficial, as well as beneficial for Afghanistan as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
I wanted to explore something you said early on. Talk about the golden rule argument. Didn't occur to me till you guys phrased it a certain way, but you don't do others what you would have done to yourself. You also said that some of the victims, the shy boys, grow up to then perpetrate the same crime. So under the golden rule, wouldn't that then be okay?
No, sir, we're not. What happens is these young boys are being recruited at such a young age, and they themselves are violating the golden rule. Do unto others as they would do unto them. They themselves are violating that rule because, but at the same time, that is what they are being being shown, which is what they are shown, what they are being brought up to live to, and that is not right ethically. Which is why we are trying to have that joint IG, trying to have that training to show that practice is wrong. They themselves are violating that rule, even though they see it themselves happen, and it's happening to them.
And a follow-on to your golden rule argument. Okay, what's the basis in Afghan culture and Islamic law for the golden rule? It's an argument that resonates with Westerners, but by virtue of the practices apparently accepted and tolerated, despite the legal framework. So what's your basis for making that argument of change?
Well, the Afghani government actually outlawed this practice, Bacha Bazi. It's only being acted by the Pashtuns, which is a tribe. It's not Afghanistan as a whole. So they already are violating it legally. Along with this, the Taliban actually did not agree with this practice. They actually persecute those who participate in Bacha Bazi, usually by death. So the Taliban themselves, who consider themselves strict followers of the Quran and whatnot, they themselves did not agree with this policy. So the Pashtuns who are enacting this, they are actually not following their own version of the Quran and other religious sources they follow.
Is there, let me back up here. You mentioned the Pashtuns,
Yes, sir.
and it's a given, at least I accept it as a given because I heard it in another one of the presentations, I didn't know it before, that over 50% of the Pashtuns don't think that there's anything really wrong with Bacha Bazi. They don't believe it's homosexual, they don't believe that it violates any laws or anything else. So my question to you is that you want to have this group of Afghani leaders get together and come out and denounce Bacha Bazi. So here's a two-part question. What incentive, given that mindset, do they have to even want to do this, to come out and denounce it? And then secondly, if the incentive is getting material and money, and you mentioned the Leahy Agreement, I'm interested at what level that Leahy Agreement can be imposed. Does it need to come out of Congress? Does the president have to get involved? Can the local area commander impose it? Because God help us if Congress or above has to get involved with that kind of decision.
Yes, sir. I'll answer your first part, but the Leahy Amendment, I'll pass it on to
Okay.
my partner. He's more educated on that amendment.
Okay.
For the first part, the article did mention the community themselves. Most of the communities don't actually agree with this practice of Bacha Bazi because they're seeing their young boys, mothers are seeing their sons being molested, sir. So it is this tribe that is enacting it, but most of Afghanistan and international do not agree with this practice. It is widely known that child molestation, child rape, and abuse is not an accepted practice.
And also to add in on that first part, that is largely what the educational portion of our policy would be. We would educate those who may think there's nothing wrong with it, who don't believe that it's sexual in any way or stuff like that. That's largely what the educational portion of our policy would be.
This is in fact a subculture, as stated within the case study, but upon observation as well, much like child molestation in the United States, is a very small subculture. So it should be treated and understood as such. Now with the Leahy Amendment, Congress is not involved. This is strictly within the Department of Defense or the Department of State. The Department of State has a separate chain of command and implementation of this policy. This policy can be implemented at the commander level, from my understanding, at about the division level. So not only the commanding general of it within Afghanistan, the commanding general of Afghan forces, U.S. forces in Afghanistan, can implement this, but also some of his subordinates. And it can be implemented at any level. So even down to a squad, the smallest operational unit, the smallest operational group in the field. So we could remove it from the state as a whole, if need be, or we can remove it, as I said, all the way down to, say, this specific police department.
Can I follow up on the Leahy Amendment?
Yes.
So I understand the premise of the amendment. I think that they can remove funding. Let me give you a hypothetical, which could have been reality. So you identify this unit that is practicing Bacha Bazi. So the local commander says, okay, you're losing your funding. But that unit has been the most successful at countering the insurgency, preventing loss of American and Afghan lives. They've figured out some formula in the local populace, and they're countering the insurgency. So now you have a choice. You remove the funding, but now there's a danger of insurgency popping back up in that area. Or you're choosing to cut off the funding because they're performing Bacha Bazi.
So on that note, we can reinstate funding to these units once they meet our prescribed recommendations. And a way to incentivize this is not punishing the unit as a whole, but merely warning the superior of that unit, not necessarily that commander committing Bacha Bazi, but to his superior, threatening to, say, take funding from the entire division, and encouraging him policing his own. So before we even need to pull funding, his superior understands, if I do not replace this man, keep the unit intact and the subordinates that are taking care of this problem at the tactical level, which would not change, hopefully, by removing this superior who is morally corrupt and replacing him with somebody even more efficient and has a good moral standing as well. So it's something we could nip in the bud early on.
Ask on your plan, the implications of your education, and then you have a joint oversight. But that, so here it's an implementation. It deals with U.S. forces, rules of engagement, joint use bases, U.S. bases. All right. Is there an obligation for U.S. forces to rescue, to intervene, rescue, and counter that arrest individuals, and use force to do so if necessary to defend themselves?
Well, sir, the policy we have now, resolute support missions to train, advise, and assist the Afghan people. It is their ultimate responsibility to police their own. And in that event, sir, if there's no direct threat to the American people, our interests are protected, and we help the Afghan government as a whole, then it's up to the local and police forces to guard that, and to joke and add on to that as well.
So on that note, as stated, we're there to advise and assist. We are not the sovereign in Afghanistan. When we are out on patrol in the public, we are not the Afghani police force. It is not in our place to act. If the Afghani police need our assistance or advice, then we can act, but not until then, simply because of the rules of engagement as they currently are. And we cannot violate the sovereignty of another state.
So, let me feedback if I understand. So, irregardless of the practice and our advocacy, then we acquiesce. We have no obligation to intervene or rescue and save the screams of that child
Sir,
in the next room over.
with our policy is to actually give our U.S. troops that procedure to report that. In some of the articles, you had some cases where they took matters in their own hands and had repercussions for their actions. Our policy is to prevent that.
Your
Yes,
policy,
sir.
you say, is to report, but otherwise you have to follow the rules of engagement. Do you have a suggested way you would like the U.S. military, Department of Defense, to change the rules of engagement so that we can stabilize the situation? Because if we're just reporting and asking the Afghan government, based on their Koran and their rules and laws, to do something about it, nothing's going to happen.
Yes,
Because
sir.
they're letting it happen right now. So
Well,
what would you do to change the rules of engagement?
Our immediate solution is if this is encountered on a forward operating base, then we would have them leave. That would solve the immediate problem of
Throw them off the
occurring.
base.
Yes, throw them off the base.
Stop, throw them off the base and report it.
Yes, sir.
But other than that, we can take no punitive action.
No, sir, but we do have long-term plans that would
Sir, we cannot take immediate action except for to protect the immediate life and of that individual as per basic human dignity and law, but we cannot take punitive action because that is an illegal act.
Understand.
And so that we are not committing a crime within the nation or even a war crime, we cannot take any punitive action.
Do you think that the United States government should change their approach to this, actually get involved and try to do something about it? Or would that compromise our other objectives in Afghanistan?
I believe that it would compromise our other objectives, and by encouraging and essentially forcing the Afghanis with threat of us pulling funding altogether to police their own and forcing them to deal with this problem, we're going to provide them with the proper education, the proper training to deal with this. But from a legal standpoint, we can't do anything. So by incentivizing, by pulling all their funding if need be, we provide a large portion of funding and assistance to their defense and their military infrastructure as a whole.
So
And,
I'll follow up on your example, we throw them off the base.
2 minutes remaining.
So do you allow them to take their enslaved individual off the base when you throw the individual off?
Well, though, based off of our policy, what we would actually be doing would be throwing the child off of the base.
So what, to add on to that, any child under the age of 18 will not be allowed in the forward operating base to prevent the practice of Bacha Bazi being enacted.
Right. So we wouldn't even be allowing them on the base.
In the first place. And on that note, from a legal standpoint, we would be reporting it to the Afghani police to arrest that individual at that moment. So that it's not us arresting the individual, it's their own state, their own country taking care of this problem. And in the event that we say that this individual has been released, has not been held in a proper court of law, then we can threaten to pull funding from the region and pull it if need be.
Is there a risk the U.S. will continue to be viewed as aligned and tolerating the practice because it's reporting only and there's no flash to bang on the corrective action for the reasons my colleague pointed, that the Afghan government has not shown the will nor the desire to take action? So does that take us, our objectives, what we represent in our operations and our activities?
We can't act just brash right away on emotions. Yes, if troops see this happening right away, they're going to be fueled with emotion, wanting to act right away. But there are consequences for those actions if they choose to proceed without reason or logic. And so our policies is to have that basis for them to turn to. We, as we mentioned before, we are not there to police the Afghan people. We are there to provide advice. We are there to provide additional support if they need be. But we are transferring the government over to them. We are no longer the ones who are in charge. It is not our country. And so we are trying to train them in the correct practices on what would be correct to lead our country in a more democratic sense.
Sir,
Let me ask this, are we changing our character and who we are?
sir, on that note, we are not. We are a nation of laws. We are not a nation where you can go and enact revenge on somebody who has done wrong to you. You must follow a court of law. You must follow the legal procedures, and that's what we're trying to implement here.
Time's up, unfortunately. Your presentation.
Thank you, John.